Hello, friends. Today, I'll tell you about the scandal of 1314 that shook France, changed the course of European history, and perhaps became the greatest royal scandal the world has ever seen. This story is so wild that even the writers of Game of Thrones would be embarrassed. How did a single woman's tip-off send 3 queens to prison? How did this scandal lead to the outbreak of the 100 Years' War? And most importantly, what really happened in the Tower of Nesle? If you're ready, let's begin our journey to Paris in the year 1314. Welcome to the year 1314, friends. In the very heart of Europe, France, one of history's most powerful and ruthless kings, is ruling, Philip IV. Now let's get to know this man, because without him, you can't understand this story. Do you know why Philip IV was called Le Bel, Philip the Fair? Because by the standards of his time, he was truly handsome. Tall, around 1.80 meters, which was unusually tall for the Middle Ages, with golden blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a commanding presence. The moment you saw him at court, you knew he was the king. But don't let appearances fool you. This man was also known as the Iron King. Why? Because in 1307, he arrested the Knights Templar, the most powerful military order of the time, all in a single night. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, across all of France, thousands of Templars were arrested simultaneously. And then what happened? Torture, forced confessions, trials, and finally, fire. In 1314, the very year of this story, the Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay was burned alive in Paris, on a small island across from Notre Dame. As the flames consumed him, he cursed Philip. Within a year, both you and I will stand before God. And guess what? By the end of that same year, both men were dead. Now let's meet Philip's family, because they are the main actors in this tragedy. Philip had 4 children, and each one would play a crucial role in this story. His eldest son, Louis X, 26 years old, serious, responsible, almost a mirror image of his father. But unlike his father, he was slightly more emotional, less cruel. He was the future king of France. The middle son, Philip V, 24 years old, strong like his father, but more diplomatic. The youngest, Charles IV, 21 years old, more carefree, more fun-loving, but equally proud. And of course, Isabella. Isabella. In 1314, she was only 19, yet already Queen of England. Philip's only daughter and his beloved jewel. As beautiful as her father, as clever as her father, and perhaps just as dangerous. Now we come to an even more intriguing part, the wives of these 3 princes. They were the 3 daughters of Robert II, Duke of Burgundy, Margaret, Blanche, and Joan. When these 3 sisters arrived in Paris, they completely changed the atmosphere of the court. Margaret of Burgundy, Louis's wife, 23 years old. Picture golden hair, green eyes, always smiling, full of life. She loved fashion, jewelry, music, and dancing. She was the joy of the court. Blanche of Burgundy, Philip's wife, Margaret's younger sister, 21 years old. Just as beautiful, but more mysterious, more flirtatious. She enjoyed attracting men's attention, and she was very good at it. Joan of Burgundy, the youngest, Charles's wife, only 19. Compared to her sisters, she was quieter, more thoughtful, but equally young and equally beautiful. When these 3 sisters came to Paris, they also brought Burgundy's freer, more lively culture with them. Because, friends, at that time the French royal court was strict, formal, and rigid. Burgundy, on the other hand, was different. Women there were freer, more social, more, how shall I put it, relaxed. And now, back to Isabella, because she was the true spark of this scandal. In 1308, when she was only 12, she was married to Edward II of England. A political marriage, of course, meant to secure peace between France and England. But the marriage was a disaster. Edward II was one of the most disastrous kings in history. Why? Because he preferred spending his time with his male favorites rather than with his wife. First Piers Gaveston, then Hugh Despenser. Isabella might have been queen, but her husband ignored her completely. Imagine it. Isabella, only 19 years old, beautiful, intelligent, strong, yet trapped in a failed marriage. Her husband neglected her, humiliated her at court, and they even struggled to produce heirs. Can you imagine what this must have done to her? At this point, Isabella began to change. She was no longer just a neglected young wife. She was becoming a strong, determined woman who knew how to take revenge. And when she came to visit her father Philip in 1314, she would return with this new strength. Now picture the atmosphere of Paris. In 1314, Paris was one of Europe's largest cities. Narrow cobblestone streets, towering Gothic cathedrals, bridges over the Seine, and of course, the famous Tour de Nesle. The Nesle Tower stood like a massive stone cylinder on the left bank of the Seine. By day, a defensive fortress for Paris, but by night, it became something entirely different. Wine-fueled parties, music, dancing, secret rendezvous. It was the hottest entertainment spot of the royal court. And within this city, among these characters, in that cold winter of 1314, a scandal was quietly taking root, one that no one yet suspected. But just a few months later, this beautiful picture would shatter into blood and tears. In the cold January of 1314, Isabella traveled to France to visit her father, King Philip. But friends, this was no ordinary family visit. Isabella was now a completely different woman. 6 years of an unhappy marriage had changed her, hardened her, perhaps even made her ruthless. When Isabella arrived in Paris, she saw her brothers' happy marriages. Margaret and Louis laughing together, Blanche and Philip dancing, Joan and Charles having romantic conversations. And something stirred inside Isabella. Was it jealousy? A thirst for revenge? Or perhaps a true sense of justice? Think about it, friends. Isabella had also been married at a young age. She too was beautiful, intelligent, and of royal blood. But her marriage was a disaster. While her sisters-in-law were loved, cherished, and admired, Isabella was living almost like an exile in England. And then one night, Isabella made a discovery that would change her life. We don't know exactly which night it was, but it was a cold February night in 1314. Isabella couldn't sleep. Maybe her mind was restless. Maybe she was making plans. And when she looked out the window, what did she see? She caught Margaret and Blanche sneaking toward the Tower of Nesle. But they weren't alone. They were with 2 young, handsome men. And Isabella's heart nearly stopped, because she knew them. Philippe and Gautier, the Diane brothers. Who were they? Not ordinary knights, friends. Their father, Bernard Diane, was an important royal official, and the brothers themselves were among the elite members of the King's Guard. Men of trust, respect, and close ties to the royal family. At first, Isabella could hardly believe what she saw. Maybe she had misunderstood, maybe it was innocent. But her curiosity grew. So the next night, she watched again. And the night after that, until what she discovered horrified her. Because, friends, this wasn't just a one-time incident. What Isabella had uncovered was a systematic affair, going on for months, maybe even years. Margaret and Blanche were regularly meeting the Diane brothers whenever their husbands were away. And there was more. As Isabella observed more closely, she uncovered shocking details. Margaret and Blanche weren't just spending time with the brothers. They were giving them gifts. Royal jewels, precious fabrics, gold coins. They may even have shown them important documents. And what about Joan? Charles's wife was in a more complicated position. She wasn't directly involved in the forbidden affairs, but she wasn't ignorant either. Isabella realized Joan knew what was happening, and had even helped arrange some of the meetings. Now imagine Isabella's state of mind in that moment. On one hand, these were her sisters-in-law, women she had grown up with, shared meals with, played games with. On the other hand, the honor of the crown, the family's prestige, even the security of the realm was at stake. And then there were Isabella's own darker feelings. The rage, jealousy, and thirst for revenge against these women with their happy marriages. Perhaps deep inside, she thought, how can they be so happy while I suffer in misery? Days passed, and Isabella wrestled with her thoughts. What should she do? Remain silent? Warn her sisters-in-law? Or should she tell her father? That last option was a grave decision, because she knew exactly what the consequences would be. And don't forget, Isabella wasn't naive. She knew very well the political stakes. She had seen what her father did to the Templars, how merciless he could be when it came to the honor of the crown. Finally, on a cold March morning, Isabella made her choice. Perhaps it was out of a sense of justice, perhaps out of duty to the crown, or perhaps, simply, out of revenge. Whatever the reason, she decided to go to her father, King Philip. Picture this scene, friends. Isabella enters her father's private chambers. At first, Philip doesn't understand why she's there. Maybe he thinks she wants to discuss her problems in England. But the words that come out of her mouth freeze him in place. "Father, I fear I bring you terrible news. My brother's wives." Isabella doesn't even finish the sentence before the color drains from Philip's face. Because before he is a father, he is a king, and nothing is more important than the honor of the crown. Isabella lays out everything. The secret nighttime meetings, the lovers at the Tour de Nesle, the exchange of gifts, Joan's silence. As Philip listens, his fury builds, his hands tremble, his breath grows heavy. And then, that terrifying fire lights up in his eyes, the same look he had when he condemned the Templars to the flames. "Is this true?" he demands of Isabella. "Are you certain of what you've seen?" Isabella nods. And then Philip utters the words that would shake the entire palace. "Then we act." From that moment, there was no turning back. Philip immediately dispatched his secret agents. The investigation began, and the fuse of the greatest scandal in French history was lit. But what no one yet knew was that this scandal would not just destroy a few lives. It would change the fate of all Europe. When King Philip took action, the palace in France did not fall silent. It erupted into a storm. No one fully understood what was happening, yet rumors began to echo through the stone walls. Agents received secret orders, guards were repositioned, and doors were locked. Those who had once been considered the most trusted friends of the royal family suddenly became suspects. In the palace, no one could trust anyone anymore. All eyes turned first to the Devamı brothers, Philippe and Gautier. These two knights were among the most respected members of the royal guard, having served the king's family for years and witnessed the most sensitive secrets of the palace. Yet now, their loyalty became their greatest vulnerability. In a midnight raid, the brothers were arrested without warning. Chains were fastened to their hands, hoods were thrown over their heads, and they were thrown into the cold stone dungeons. The first day passed in silence. Perhaps they thought they might survive, perhaps King Philip's anger would subside. But they soon realized they faced no ordinary enemy. This was the Iron King. Just as he had dealt with the Templar Knights, Philip would show no mercy, even to his own guards. And so, the torture began. Bound in chains, in a dark room, they were burned with heated irons, interrogated with bone-crushing instruments. Their screams echoed through the underground dungeons of Paris night after night. Eventually, the Devamı brothers broke. They confessed everything. How the forbidden liaisons had begun, in which rooms they had met, and for how many years this betrayal had continued. They even detailed the gifts they had received: royal jewels, precious fabrics, gold coins, everything laid bare. From that point onward, there was no hope of escape. But the real shock came when it was the turn of the royal brides. Margaret and Blanche, who had been the beloved princesses of France just a day ago, were now chained and thrown into cells. In their eyes, there was not fear so much as disbelief. Overnight, everything around them changed. Servants who had once smiled at them now looked away. Even their most loyal ladies-in-waiting turned their backs. The punishment for betrayal had begun, not just in the court, but in everyday life. Joan's situation was more complicated. She had not directly engaged with the Devamı brothers. Yet she had known about their secret meetings, remained silent at times, and even facilitated a few of their encounters. In other words, she was complicit. Matters became even more complex when it was revealed that Joan was pregnant. A single question haunted everyone: whose child was in her womb? If it was not Charles's, the very future of the French throne could fall into crisis. This doubt alone was enough to shake the royal dynasty. The trial began. In the great hall, surrounded by Gothic columns, King Philip sat upon his high throne. Before him were judges, clergy, and nobles. The air was icy. Margaret, Blanche, and Joan were brought in chains, their faces pale, eyes filled with despair. No commoners were allowed in the courtroom, for this was not merely a family scandal. It was a matter of state. Witnesses were called. Palace servants, ladies-in-waiting, even guards, all recounted what they had seen. Some had seen the Devamı brothers sneaking into the tower at night. Others had observed the gifts given by the princesses. Each new testimony increased the weight of the crime. Finally, the confessions extracted under torture were read aloud in court. The Donay brothers' own words shattered Margaret and Blanche. At that moment, denial became meaningless. Their royal dignity vanished, replaced by shame and disgrace. In the courtroom, one voice echoed through the silence, the firm, commanding voice of King Philip. Everyone present heard the words that would change the course of history. Whoever mocks the honor of the French crown, whoever tarnishes its dignity, should expect no mercy. And so the verdict was decided. Death for the Donay brothers, imprisonment for Margaret and Blanche, and a different fate for Joan. But this was only the beginning. The true horror would unfold on the day of the executions. The trial had concluded, the verdict delivered. Yet Paris was far from silent. Whispers and rumors spread through the stone walls, carried from ear to ear. The punishments decreed by King Philip were not merely examples of law. They were among the harshest in history. And on that day, the people of Paris would witness one of the most terrifying executions ever recorded. The first victims were the Donay brothers, Philippe and Gautier. The stage prepared for them was not only for death, but for spectacle and warning. They were first displayed publicly, chains binding them, exposed in the main square. All eyes were upon them, filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. No one knew exactly what would happen, but everyone understood one thing. This would not be an ordinary punishment. Then the torture began. The cruel face of medieval justice revealed itself. Their skin was flayed while they were still alive. Every scream echoed through the streets of Paris. The brutality elicited both fear and morbid fascination among the onlookers. These were no ordinary criminals. They had betrayed the royal family and shattered the trust of the palace. The horror escalated further, castration. Their crime was not only forbidden love, it was an attack on the honor of the crown. Finally, their heads were severed. The ghastly scene displayed in Paris's main square shocked the populace. Thousands gathered, not to flee, but to witness and be warned. At that moment, the people of Paris were not attending a history lesson. They were spectators of a macabre and bloody spectacle. For the women, the punishments were different. Death was spared, yet the suffering was worse than death itself. Margaret and Blanche, once the darlings of the French royal court, were now chained, their hair shaved, dressed in monk-like garments, and sent to the cold, dark dungeons of Château Gallard. This fortress lay far from Paris, a place where sunlight never penetrated, damp and deathly silent. Margaret gave birth there, but her child died within days. Whether from illness, cold, or neglect remained unknown. Margaret could endure only 1 year within those shadowed walls. In 1315, at just 24 years old, she perished. Some said illness claimed her, others claimed she was strangled. The truth was never revealed, adding another layer of tragedy to her story. Blanche, however, endured 8 long years in the dungeons. Until 1322, the finest years of her life passed behind cold stone walls. When finally released, she was an entirely changed woman, her hair white, her health broken, her spirit shattered. Her story was a stark example of how imprisonment could destroy the human soul. Joan fared relatively better. She was pregnant and had not committed the crime directly. She was sentenced only to house arrest. Yet socially, she was entirely ostracized, excluded from court events, avoided by all, forced to live like a living ghost. And the child? Joan's child survived, but uncertainty about the father, Charles or another, hung over her life like a shadow, never fully resolved. The impact of these punishments extended far beyond Paris. European royal families, hearing of France's harsh measures, were appalled. The message was clear: no one mocks the French royal family, and all who betray its honor will pay dearly. Philip's ruthlessness demonstrated that even his own family would not escape his wrath. Thus, Paris froze as if it were a stage set in history. The executions, the dungeons, and the losses altered not just individual lives, but the fate of an entire dynasty. Once again, it became clear: royal honor, power, and betrayal could destroy even those closest to you. The effects of this scandal were not limited to that period, my friends. On the contrary, it changed the course of European history. First of all, the prestige of the Capetian dynasty was dealt a heavy blow. The legitimacy of the children of Margaret and Blanche was questioned. This opened the door to struggles for the throne. More importantly, Isabella's denunciation shows her true character. She had now become a strong woman who loved revenge. And when she returned to England, she organized a rebellion against her husband, Edward II. In 1327, Isabella deposed and killed her husband. She placed her son Edward III on the throne. And here, the bigger picture emerges. Edward III, being the son of Isabella, a French princess, also claimed the French throne. And thus, in 1337, the 100 Years' War began. That scandalous night in the Tower of Nesle ultimately laid the foundation for a century-long war between England and France. This is how history is written, my friends. Sometimes a small betrayal can drag entire continents into war. The Tour de Nesle scandal was not just a royal gossip. It was the beginning of a great chain of events that changed Europe's destiny. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Comment below which historical scandal you'd like to see next. See you in the next video.